I'm going to read two sections. The first is, what do you need to know? The character, he's one of the main four characters whom you're going to meet. His name is Timothy Skaggs. He's a former reporter. He's in New York City. He's a former reporter. He writes cheap, sensationalist paperback pamphlet novels. He's a sort of a scalawag, and he's 35 years old. He's just discovered photography. What else do you need to know? The Mexican War has just ended. I think that's all the background information you need to set this up. March 10th, 1848, New York City. His thick specs and beard notwithstanding, Skaggs certainly did not look like an old man. His freckles gave his face a youngish aspect, as did his quick smile. Yet the world he'd known as a youth was gone. Skaggs had been born during a war against the British, which now seemed impossibly quaint, back when the flag carried half as many stars. What's more, he remembered founding fathers. When Skaggs was a boy, Monroe had been president, and Jefferson was still alive. When he first smoked, friction matches did not exist. It was only in the previous decade that he had arrived in New York City, but it might as well have been another century. Photography had been a fantasy back then. There were no one-penny papers, no private shops selling meats and fruits, no baseball, and precious few theaters or foreigners. For all that, and even though he was this very day turning 35, Timothy Skaggs did not feel old. He still had all but 3 of his teeth, and his social anatomy, as he called it, remained in good working order, except on those nights when he consumed very large amounts of brandy or opium. He could still roister until dawn, and as his father had put it in a birthday letter Skaggs received a few hours ago, he still filled his days and nights with, quote, the pointless puerile amusements of a conceited sluggard or first-class wastrel. The elder Mr. Skaggs professed distaste for most new things and practically all new words, but last year he had discovered wastrel and could not resist using it as often as possible in his letters to his son. He had assumed that after failing to become a physician, Timothy would take up some respectable clerkish employment in Wall Street. For to Jacob Skaggs, writing satirical articles and trashy novels was puerile. Making daguerreotypes, pictures, a task engaging his youngest child at this very moment, was pointless. Timothy was most assuredly not, in his own estimation, a sluggard. He worked at several different jobs. None of his occupations, however, was likely to produce much in the way of wealth or reputation. It was unlikely, but not impossible, that he might yet blossom into the American Dickens or Thackeray. Both of those men, Skaggs knew with dispiriting precision, were only a year older than he, and they had become Dickens and Thackeray already. Skaggs had informed no one that today was his birthday. This particular March 10th struck him as too important to turn into one more excuse for an evening of sloppy toasts and rude jokes. He felt strangely sober, his mind a-twitter with thoughts about unfulfilled promise, unknown destiny, undiscovered calling. Timothy Skaggs always wished to be and to appear blithe, so his present mood was highly uncharacteristic. It was not that he wanted for money or envied the rich. Oh, he harbored a few small professional grudges against successful peers. He felt competitive, for instance, with Matthew Brady, whom he called, quote, our ass-kissing, celebrity-worshipping, money-grubbing camera boy, unquote. Brady was only 25. Among the stray fragments of information teeming in Skaggs's brain were the birth dates, not just of everyone he knew, but, and this embarrassed him a little, of almost every well-known person near his own age. He really didn't feel much jealousy toward the great men, however. He had known a few such personages, such as Frank Pierce, age 43. When Skaggs was growing up in New Hampshire, Frank had been the most promising boy in Hillsborough, the most admired student at school, the most respected young lawyer in the state. After Frank resigned his U.S. Senate seat because his wife believed that life in Washington forced her husband to drink too much whiskey, Skaggs realized that men like Pierce and he were different creatures fundamentally. When Frank had enlisted as a private soldier to fight in the war, Skaggs wrote an article commending his boyhood acquaintance for his courage. His courage to admit that sweltering heat, disease, and carnage in Mexico was preferable to the same time alone with Jane Pierce in frigid New Hampshire. Timothy's brother Jonah, a junior partner with Pierce's law firm, pleaded with Timothy to send a letter of apology to Mrs. Pierce, which he finally wrote last summer after Frank fell off his horse in Mexico and broke a leg. Horace Greeley, aged 37, was the other great man whom Skaggs had known before greatness was visited upon him. They had been young newspaper hacks together, fellow New Hampshire emigres. Even when Greeley had held more serious opinions, of which he was, even then, Greeley had held more serious opinions, of which he was more certain than any young person Skaggs ever knew. Most of the Tribune's liberal ideas Timothy more or less shared: an end to the new business monopolies, freedom for the slaves. But Greeley's fanatical rectitude against alcohol, against tobacco, against prostitution, he could not tolerate. Hadn't the both of them rushed from New Hampshire as boys in order to escape all that crab satrappery, not to carry the moral war to Manhattan? During the winter of 1844, he became so weary of the virtuousness that for a while he stopped reading the Tribune on principle. No, Skaggs was not a big bug like Pierce or Greeley. No big bug would be found on a chilly Friday afternoon on the sidewalk at the intersection of Nassau and Fulton Streets, squinting into a camera with a yard of brown cloth draped over his head. Skaggs twisted the brass focus knob a final jot forward and back, making the image on the glass a hair sharper. He adored focusing. It provided him the momentary, happy, godlike sensation of controlling one small spot in the universe. And, of course, he adored the opportunity, godlike as well, that photography afforded him to stare at people, to examine every detail of their eyes and lips, their bellies and bosoms, their fingernails and skin. The blue man lay on his side in the gutter a few feet in front of the tripod, illuminated by a column of sunlight, undoubtedly the day's last. As Skaggs looked into his ground glass, studying the image, upside down, but so much more vivid than any unaided view through air, he wished it were possible to take a photograph depicting this poor riffraff's shade of blue. Not by exposing the plate to extra sunlight or hand-tinting the picture with paint, practices that Skaggs considered vulgar, but by some chemical means to capture the actual blue color on the plate. He had read in Scientific American about a Frenchman who had made such a picture, but the color image could not be fixed, and so it disappeared. Such evanescence struck Skaggs as worse than no color at all. All the while he was setting up his camera, which took a good 10 minutes, the blue man had been humming the tune to King Alcohol, the Hutchinson family's hit about the evils of drink. When the fellow suddenly began to sing the words as well, "For there's rum and gin and beer and wine and brandy of logwood hue," it was too much for Skaggs. He pulled the little curtain of tow cloth from his head and replaced the cap over the lens. The song was increasing in volume as well. Passers-by had been stopping to watch Skaggs and the blue man, and the song was attracting more spectators. And hock and port and flip combined to make a man look blue. "All right, sir," Skaggs said to the blue man, "our moment has come. I'm about to make your portrait. No jiggling for the next while." "Whoopee," the blue man replied. "I'm in the show business, the show business, the show business." "If this were the show business," Skaggs told him, "the wage would be more than the shilling I'm paying you." He carefully pulled the viewing glass from the slot in the camera and replaced it with the plate holder. "But you're making me the star of Journalismville for an hour." The blue man pointed at the small crowd behind Skaggs who had stopped to watch. "The star of Journalismville?" Skaggs said. "Is that what you said, sir?" He was startled now beyond mere amusement. Among these several blocks, an L-shaped district just west of City Hall and the park, at least half of New York's dailies and magazines and book publishers and lithographers had their offices. Journalismville was a coinage new to Skaggs, perhaps new to the world. As for star, he'd never heard anyone outside the theater use the term. "Now then, sir, entirely still, please. Is it sunshiny enough to make the picture?" "For the moment, yes. Are you quite ready?" "May I keep my mouth open? I go frightened if I breathe only through my nose for very long." "By all means. Do what you must to breathe, Skaggs said, but you must not move. Do you understand? I'll count to 10, and when I'm finished, you may sing and shout and jump all you wish. He lifted the handle up to uncover the plate. In this position, the plate holder reminded him of a cocked guillotine, ready to snatch a tiny head. The blue man arranged himself in the gutter, resting his chin on one hand and opening his mouth wide. He asked, his lips 2 inches apart. Am I okay? Very still now. Skaggs reached out and in one swift motion pulled off the lens cap. 1 California, 2 California, 3. One of the fellow's eyes twitched. 8 California, 9 California, 10. He replaced the cap tight and shoved the dark slide down. Excellent. Thank you. Thank you, sir. The blue man stood and took Skaggs's 2 half-dimes. Twilight was descending now. As he walked past the Express, the Post, the Commercial Advertiser, the Journal of Commerce, the Courier and Inquirer, down one of the principal lanes in Journalismville, the wind whipping from the east felt like the beginning of a winter blow. The equipment had become a burden by the time he turned toward his studio. He reminded himself to end the casual self-deception, not his studio, Ninian Bobo's studio, where Skaggs worked as a kind of tenant farmer, required to sell half his monthly crop of portraits for the owner. It was not the gathering darkness and cold disheartening him, nor even his annoying arrangement with Bobo. Rather, it was the letter from New Hampshire in his pocket. What rankled most were the final lines. Your mother and I understand that you are unsuited to a prosperous, productive, and respectable life like that of your brother Jonah. You write your squibs and stories. So be it. However, we both pray fervently that from the vantage point of your 36th year, you might finally begin to sight land in the distance and make for it with all due haste. Do you understand? I will no longer chastise you for your blasphemer's wastrel life, nor repeat that New York is too much of a good thing. But none of our journeys is endless, Timothy. Death takes us when it wishes, whether or not we have reached our chosen destinations. Choose, as ever, your loving father. Have a happy birthday, son, and don't forget for a moment that death lurks. Blasphemer? Yes. But wastrel? Bunk. His bank account never exceeded $50, but he was not, as his father seemed determined to believe, a lounger, a player, a New York City sporting man. He did not frolic during the day, did not play bowls and billiards and attend shooting galleries and poker dens and cockfight pits, never idled away afternoons in taverns complaining about the scrofulous, dirty, stinking, stupid, thieving, willful, drunken Irish. He had spent a morning last winter, on one of his final days as a reporter, watching all the passengers of the HMS Sir Henry Pottinger, one of the first famine ships from Belfast, creep and stumble onto Pier 27. The whole scrofulous, dirty, stinking, weeping, freezing, wheezing, skinny, dazed, pale, half-naked lot of them. Like every other New Yorker, he was accustomed to ignoring everyday misery, but his hours spent studying and counting those 423 Irish men, women, and children had shocked him into a kind of reverent despair. But alas, the reproofs in his father's letter were only a magnified version of Timothy's own accumulating doubts. His life was indeed something of a pleasant waste, diverting but pointless, like a puzzle or a game of cards. His wit and his knowledge of a great many subjects, such a plenitude of facts, as if, his father would say, to compensate for his paucity of faith, made him skillful at games of all kinds. But the games of writing for newspapers and cheap book publishers had become too easy and comfortable. Photography was still novel and strange, to Skaggs and to the rest of the world. No one was fluent with chemical picture making the way they were with pens and paintbrushes. For the moment, everyone was an amateur. Photography was a science and craft consisting entirely of immense possibility. Skaggs's strange pictures of firemen and tramps and harlots seemed oblique and mysterious to him, as if something profound and unknowable was being suggested by the image's very exactitude. 2 newsboys, their arms full of papers, ran past him, interrupting his thoughts. The first one slowing down to shout in his face, "Herald, sir, latest news from Washington. Mexico is ours," squealed the other. "Already know that, newsboys," he said, sending them on their way. Mexico may be ours, but What on earth is mine, precisely? Perhaps his bit of dejection about turning 35 was no epiphany, just a whiff of the blues on a late winter breeze. But it was also, he knew, a definite foretaste of something more bitter and poisonous. As he pushed open the front door with his shoulder and stepped into the darkness, he formed a clear-eyed thought. If my life remains unchanged when I turn 40 or 45, and why should it not, then I will count myself a failure. Given his distrust of most sorts of success, that put Timothy Skaggs in a very hard place. Many, many months later, and many miles and adventures later, several different characters are in the West. Polly Lucking is the actress and part-time prostitute to whom Joe referred earlier, but she's also a kind of earnest would-be utopian, actually looking for her own utopia in the West. She's taken under her wing a 13-year-old, almost 14-year-old prostitute who's been viciously abused by her father and taken her out of New York City to what she hopes will be a new life in the West. And Billy Whipple, who is an apostate former Mormon of 18 who has become Priscilla's fiancé, is with them as well. August 21st, 1848, Canesville, Iowa. At high noon on a breezy, hot, cloudless August day, the Missouri River current nudged the flat-bottomed ferry boat 500 feet south and west along a rope stretched between the two banks, out of Iowa and the United States and over to Indian country. 2 canvas-covered wagons, 2 families, a handcart, 8 oxen, and a mule shared the deck with another group of travelers, 2 young women from New York and a young man from Indiana, who were just off the Omega, their St. Louis steamer. As they approached the far side of the river, they watched 2 human figures who stood near the landing, 2 half-naked men, 2 Indians. "Uh-huh," the ferry tender said, sounding bored. "They'll want a biscuit or a coin or what have you." The men's black hair hung to their shoulders, and both wore only breechcloths. Neither was young. The older one had placed a large piece of bark on the dried mud in front of them and held a large stick cut with notches in one hand and in his other a smaller stick. As soon as all the white people were off the boat, he started to hum a tune and rub the small stick across the notches to make a rhythmic rasp. His companion began to dance. The dancer looked to Polly as if he were pantomiming a run and playing a game of patty cake. Unlike the gyrating Indians she had seen on the stage at Barnum's in New York City, these were unarmed and serene and sad. She placed a penny on the bark, and then she and the others started up a trail toward the town, which appeared much bigger than St. Joseph in Missouri, the largest place they had seen since leaving St. Louis. It stretched a mile along the river behind a picket fence that ran even longer. They came first to a large corral, empty of animals. Not far away, a grist mill's water wheel spun freely in its creek, disengaged from the gears and stones inside. Next to the mill was a log fortress, 30 feet on each side, a building more than twice as large as any log cabin they had seen along any of the rivers. Its only windows were cut into the thick earthen roof. Nearby were stores and workshops and dozens of houses. No, hundreds of houses. Some were built of sod bricks, but most were made of logs with roofs of straw and willow branches and turf. Each had a surname painted or carved on its door. The 3 visitors walked slowly down a wide dirt main street, crossing 2, 3, 4 streets, and stopped. 10 streets remained before them. It was a small city. Every building was new, and there was not a soul in sight. The only noises were whippoorwills and turkeys and the flapping of waxcloth squares tacked in the window openings of the log houses. Only 2 years earlier, this had been an empty bluff where birds and deer were occasionally shot, a mere 100 out of the 1,000,000 acres hunted by the local Indians. And then suddenly, weirdly to the Oto and the Omaha, who had become accustomed to the trickle of laughing, angry, frightened, childlike wanderers in their wagons passing through on their way, the whites believed, to some western ocean, one particular horde of white people and their cattle had crossed the river and stopped here, on this good scrap of the Indians' land and stayed. They'd called themselves saints. They declared the riverbank their winter quarters, which sounded reassuringly temporary to the natives, although the whites had remained for 2 winters before moving west. For 2 summers, 2 falls, 2 winters, and 2 springs, the saints had jammed themselves into their queer square city and outnumbered all of the Oto and Omaha by 2 to 1. But then, only a few months ago, the last of them disappeared into the sunset as suddenly as they had all arrived, loading up and driving their 1,000 wagons toward the bleak country occupied by the Arapaho and, may the whites' God protect them, the Dakota, and over the mountains to the great desert. Why? They had simply abandoned all their buildings and burial grounds, into which they had so recently invested so much furious sweat and pride. If they'd really known beforehand that they were going to leave 2 years after they arrived, why had they constructed permanent houses and stores? Not to mention their inexplicable wooden fence that stretched for 2 miles along the river. Was it all some monument to themselves or their God, or some utterly bewildering folly? And why had such busy people failed to harvest and store enough wild grapes and plums and berries and roots and leaves in the summer and fall so that during the winter their flesh would not become scrawny and sick and black and dead? The saints had promised the Indians that after they left they would never return, and said that any Omaha or Oto was free to take up residence in the square houses, to live in the city as if it were their own. And the offer apparently had been intended neither as a trap nor as a joke. From the start, the saints had explained their ways by saying they were a peculiar people, a white tribe, in the phrase of the interpreter. But to the Oto and the Omaha, the Mormons were simply insane. Their tribe, they told the Indians, without smiles or embarrassment, had been created 16 years before. The Indians were sure there had been some mistake in the translation. No wonder the other whites in the east had driven them west across the big rivers, to be rid of them for good. Since last spring, the Oto had been debating whether their descendants would believe a century hence, long after all the log houses had rotted into the earth, this story of the 10,000 white saints appearing from the east, building a city, and then almost immediately, for no good reason at all, disappearing into the west forever. Would the children of their children's children consider it an exaggeration or hallucination or some ancient fable? But since such an event had actually happened here on this very spot before their own eyes, some of them said, well then, all the old tales of talking bears and shape-shifting women must be true as well. Thank you very much. I knew, as I say, very little about this period, but once I spent about a year and a half researching it as I was making the story and trying to feel as though I knew enough about it to evoke it with some realism and truth. And it was somehow this period was a blank in my my school history. I knew very little about it, and what I came to believe is that it's one of the most important moments in our history. One of the moments, maybe the moment, in my view, where so much of how we live today and what we think of as modern life was sort of just germinating and just clicking into focus. From technology, the camera, photography had just been invented, the telegraph had just been invented, the whole country was suddenly wired, the railroads were suddenly building like crazy, and you could suddenly travel 50 miles an hour. Media were new, as we know them, advertising, our first imperial war of choice against Mexico. It was, in so many ways, I discovered, feminism was just starting in New York State that summer. The first great suffrage convention took place. I kept being reminded of a line that I've always loved that is attributed to Mark Twain usually, which is that history may not repeat itself, but it definitely rhymes. And I really felt as though I heard the rhyme as I was plunging into 1848. It's an extraordinary time, and And one of the appeals of, as I started thinking about setting this story I had in mind there in this period, was the sort of virgin territory that it was. That it unlike the era of the Civil War and the Old West and the later part of the 19th century, which has been written about and had films made about, and which we know so well in so many ways, this hadn't been treated fictionally or very, very much, as I say, in our kind of popular historical imagination. So it was. I hope it's so far readers have felt as though they're opening a door to discover a piece of America when America was sort of really just making itself up that they hadn't known. That's all I have to say in terms of prepared remarks, and I'm happy to answer anybody's questions about anything you'd like to ask. Yeah. Well, I began, the two events that I began that really were the kind of magnetic poles of my story, that I invented these characters in the story to go between, were on February, basically the same month, the first month of 1848, when an amazing number of world-changing events happened, two of them being the revolutions, these 50 revolutions that spread through Europe. The first one happened in Paris. 3 days later, the monarchy had abdicated, and exactly 4 weeks before that, gold had been discovered in California, actually, the beginning of 48. So my characters, being fictional characters, were lucky enough to be already halfway across the country when they heard word of the gold discovery, thus learned it earlier than the people back east who didn't really get the news until the late summer or fall, so they were already halfway there. The year of gold's discovery, 1848, was an amazing year. 1849 was amazing in its own way because all these tens of thousands of people from the East and from Europe and all over the place suddenly rushed out there, some of whom made money, most of whom didn't. But if you were there early enough, it was like magical. It was magic. It was all. I mean, there were exaggerations about people finding, gold, but it was really as an extraordinary time as could be, and land for the taking, and docile natives, and temperate weather. So it was this extraordinary time, and once the gold rush happened, and it was the sort of some people lucky and most people not, the way life usually is, sort of kicked back into gear. So the story takes place from early, basically the spring of 48, or February 48 to the end of 49. And one thing in my research that was amazing about the gold rush was to read. I read a lot of contemporary newspaper accounts and diaries and things, and even as quickly as like 1853, 1854, just 5 years after the initial rush, people were talking about it with this sense of awe and as if it were a time of long ago. That this frenzy and this fever and this kind of, you could really pick up gold rocks out of the road or the stream, seemed almost impossible to believe to them. Again, another way in which we think of, time moves so fast today. Well, I really got the sense that in this case, time moved very quickly then, too, and suddenly it was a different era, Yes, sir.
When you talk about the extraordinary time of 1848, you've drawn a parallel, I thought, of War with Turn of the Century, and that book seems to be sort of a logical or illogical extension of all these technological advances you're talking about, and just society in general latching on to something new. In the case of the dot-com boom and all that stuff, it's the same. You wrote with the same kind of energy about both times.
Well, it's funny that you say that. About halfway through this book, I came down, I finished the writing day and came down and said to my wife at lunch, I'm writing the same book again. I mean, it's said 150 years earlier. No, but it is, it wasn't intentional, but you're quite right. And one reviewer, the reviewer in Vanity Fair, mentioned that very thing, and I was happy to have it be said. No, it was this sort of extraordinary inflection point in modern life that had this sort of great technological change and kind of financial mania as part of it as well. Yeah.
Follow-up.
Sure.
How did you get the concept of writing 20th century 1 year ahead of time? I thought that was really cool.
Oh, thank you very much. I don't know. That's the answer. I published this book, my last novel, in 1999. And it was set in 2000. I don't know where that came, but that was an idea of it from very early on. It had the effect of giving me a pretty hard deadline, among other things, and they rushed it out, bless them, to get it out in the spring of '99. It seemed, because if you remember back then in 1999, right? I mean, it was the millennium. It was this big portal we were going to walk through, and the Y2K panic and all that stuff. It struck me as interesting to imagine this time that I grew up thinking of as the future, the 21st century, and so much of that world that I sketched was, in its way, this strange, disorienting, futuristic kind of world, even though it was, in that case, 6 months or 1 year in the future. So that sense that that what we grew up thinking of as the future had, in a certain sense, in terms of the technology and other things, had come true, a lot of it. And here we were on the verge of the 21st century, 2001. Struck me as, it was just one of the things I was playing with, the sense of we'd sort of finally arrived at the future in some way. So that's how that idea came across. And I'm happy that when people read the book in 2006 and 2007 and still feel as though it holds up. So you I guess, if you read it when it came out, had the pleasure of having the looking forward rather than looking slightly back. But no, I was pleased the way that happened. Yes.
The book seems to be full of historical tale, which I find fascinating, and I hope it's all true. So you didn't make up all these things about the waterworks, and it's all true.
It's all true. I mean, the fiction. I mean, the people. I mean, obviously, and individual events. But all that stuff that you imagine is real is real. Yes. Yeah.
I was going to believe it was all true.
Oh, do no. Just Google a few things. You'll see. It's all real. Wow. Yes, sir.
Did you use any visual aids to describe some scenarios or people?
I don't know, not in a specific way so much, but I did just during my year or two of research, I collected a whole box full of visual aids in a general way of prints of the time, photographs of people, just to sort of allow myself to immerse in that world as much as possible. I also had, when I was just, I think, at the end of my research and just starting to write, I had the good fortune of getting to curate this little show about 1848 at the Smithsonian's Design Museum in New York, which is called the Cooper Hewitt. And out of that, they gave me free entree into the warehouses of the Smithsonian, which was awesome, to spend a couple of days just going through and looking at Morse's actual telegraph key and all this stuff. So more than just pictures, it was great to be able to actually touch the things, I used maps because, for instance, there's scenes that take place in Paris, and what I discovered is that the streets of Paris in 1848 bear only some resemblance to the streets of Paris today, so I used period maps. But in terms of, no, I didn't use a picture of individuals to describe them, and the pictures, the prints of a building here or there, in some ways weren't evocative enough to be that helpful. I mean, they were, again, I had my pictures and I pinned them up occasionally when I was writing about New York or San Francisco. But it was more of a general sort of inspiration wall than a specific aid to writing a specific scene. Yeah. Yeah. Well, it's hard. I mean, we can only really speak from our own lifetime and experience. But I guess the great surprise to me, one of the great kind of revelations to me was the sense of acceleration and quickness then. I mean, not for everyone. If you lived on a farm in Georgia or Nebraska, life didn't change very quickly. Or that sense of accelerated change wasn't there. But if you lived in New York or Chicago or London or Boston, I think the sense of change was just discombobulating. I mean, really, the fact that as I talk about Skaggs, how quickly everything had changed. That in this one decade. There had been nothing, instantaneous communication didn't exist, now it did. And to me, for instance, all of the refinements of telephone and television and everything else since are kind of refinements. This quantum change of suddenly going from this olden period to this modern period, I think, there have been other moments like that, like in the early 20th century, but I think sometimes that we have a sense today, that it never stops in a certain way, and I wonder if that's real or if it's partly a function of the kind of 24/7 media chatter about it in a certain way. That it gives a sense of this a kind of an illusion of speed, even beyond the actual speed of change. Yes, one's conventional thought is that, gosh, things are a lot more. The acceleration is the pace of change is accelerating itself. But there was something reassuring to me, I guess, that in the 1840s, we've been through these insanely fast changing periods before. You could say that, and then it slows down for a while, and then you had the Civil War and the time after, which was an incredible rate of national social change as well. But I guess I mean, who knows when we get to that tipping point moment when it's going like that, and you read people talking. Experts like this guy Raymond Kurzweil talking about that we're about to reach some moment in terms of mechanical intelligence and thinking machines where it's going to take off to these unimaginable degrees, maybe even in our lifetime, with machines that are indistinguishable from humans. So, talk to me in 20 years, I guess. And if we're there then yeah, we're at that. We're at that tipping point, but it's hard to say. Yes.
Following up the question about historical accuracy, on your personal website, you have a challenge that there are two facts that were factually inaccurate in the book, and if somebody discovered them, you give them $1 million or something.
Yeah, something like that.
Something like that. Has anyone succeeded in finding these facts, and if so, what?
No, one person suggested an error that she thought was an error that wasn't an error, that wasn't one of those two, and I had to sort of set her straight of why it wasn't an error. No, otherwise, people have suggested a few things that weren't those. And I'd be happy to tell you what well, no, then you could tell other people, I guess, and you could win the prize yourself. But no, there are two small errors, and it was a thought I had as the paperback was being published, and it occurred to me that, I'm happy that I corrected these two errors. They're pretty inconsequential.
Well, let me follow up.
Yeah.
Do you have any historians of the period read the book to tell you whether you were?
I didn't. And I've been surprised. No doubt there are more than two small errors, two that have been found that I know about. But I was surprised that more historians, and I've talked about this book and this period to NYU and at serious gatherings of academics who could and should challenge me. But so far, nobody has said, "Oh, you've got it all wrong," or "This is stupid," or "This is crazy." At that NYU appearance before all these professors, one person who was a sort of one of the world-renowned experts in the history of fashion, and I'd read a piece from the book in which I referred to organza, the cloth organza, and afterwards she said, "What is your source for that?" I said, "I don't know. This isn't a nonfiction. I don't remember my source. I can dig it up and I can maybe try to find it." Because I don't think in 1848 they were calling it organza yet. Okay, thank you very much. And after that lunch, later that afternoon, I emailed my literary agent and said, "Yeah, it was fine except for this." And bless her heart, her assistant looked up on the online Oxford English Dictionary, found a citation for organza from 1820, emailed it to me. I was able to email it to the organizer of the thing, and the woman apologized to me by sunset. So, no, so far that I assumed, given how much, bits of history I've woven in here, that I would, face greater challenges. But so far, nobody's busted me in a big way. Yeah.
You sort of talked about the fact that we don't know much about this period in history, aren't taught that much. Did you run into characters from the period that we should know better?
I did, and gosh, like who? None of them that are. There are the major characters, the Edgar Allan Poes and the Walt Whitmans. A lot of minor characters who I'm not sure you should know about, but I thought about writing an article about these extraordinary minor characters who aren't significant. That's why we don't know them. But for instance, I didn't know about this group of. I didn't know very much about the Mexican War. I didn't know that, or I know just maybe a little tiny bit about this fact, which is that most of the regular U.S. Army soldiers in the Mexican War were Irish, new immigrants, largely Irish and German, mostly Catholic, who basically were scooped up and paid and joined the Army and sent down to Mexico. And some hundreds of them got down there and found being ordered by their Protestant Catholic hating officers to kill these Catholic peasants in Mexico, said no, and not only deserted but formed their own Mexican battalion to turn around and fight the Americans. And they're big heroes in Mexico, as you would think today. There are monuments to them down there. And I knew very little about that, for instance. I didn't know, and people, I don't know this, and it works into the book a little bit. Edgar Allan Poe, and he died at the beginning of 1849, so this is his last year of life. Early in 1848, he gave this amazing lecture at a thing not unlike this in New York City one night about his sort of dreamy, poetic, but uncannily prescient understanding of time and space and essentially the Big Bang, which of course is about 50 or 80 years before people had that understanding of how the universe was created. And he published it right before he died, called Eureka, and it's this extraordinary essay, and so that was, that was something that I found just amazing. There are all kinds of little guys. There was a guy in New York City called Mike Walsh, who was known as Mad Mike Walsh, who ran a newspaper called The Subterranean that was closed because of libel, and was a big political figure and a democratic political figure who was really advocating socialist revolution at the time. And I'd never heard of that guy. And there are 50, 100 guys like that, or women like that I came across. A woman called Mary Gove, who was this early sort of feminist natural health expert who went around talking about sort of vegetarianism and drinking 8 gallons of water a day as a cure for what ailed you, and also advocated free love and the end of marriage. I mean, it was, it's funny because we think of, this is the Victorian time, right? We think of that connotes a certain set of, they're all, boring prigs, and quite the opposite. Sure, there were Victorians as well, but there was, it was in many ways, a very experimental, madcap time when, people were certainly drinking like crazy and taking drugs, and something like 1/10 of the women in New York, it was estimated, in 1848 were prostitutes, earned part of their living as prostitutes. It was, so for all the Victorianism, it was also a wild era. Yes, ma'am.
I'd like to know your authority for saying Charles Darwin had a problem with flatulence.
More than one biography of Charles Darwin talks about his problem with flatulence. No, it was a lifelong problem. Yes, well, yeah. I mean, I'm not sure it was central to who he was, as I sort of made it in the novel. But
Maybe that's why he had to sail so far away.
well, there you go. Exactly.
Well, I surely didn't make it up.
No. Yep. It's true. I'm afraid it's true. Yeah. Thank you very much. Oh, yes. Sorry. Yep. Geographically, you mean? Or, you mean how? Well, these revolutions took place. These political revolutions took place in Europe, and they were all crushed and rolled back within the year. Spoiler alert. And trains were being built, and the same technology was happening in Europe. But basically, after these revolutions were rolled back, the same old monarchical sort of late feudal system was reinstated. So it really was an American thing in a significant way. The other thing, interestingly, abolitionism had just moved into the was just moving into the mainstream. In 1835 or 1838, it was still this crazy left-wing idea, and it was this one of the reasons this period interested me. It was just before the fissures that became the Civil War were irresistible and inevitable and sort of on everybody's mind. It was just before that, and the fact that there was free soil parties about whether we should have slavery in the West and all that, but it wasn't this, like, if you'd done polls then like you do now, what issues concern you most? It wouldn't have been very high on the list, I don't think. And that was a sort of sobering thing, that you can think that something so tremendous and traumatic just 13 years away, just around the corner, was still sort of not such a big deal. And you know, it naturally makes me think, what could be 13 years away from now that we're isn't even on our radar, you know? So, thank you very much.